So I'm a doctoral researcher at the... Is this automatic? Okay. So I do research at the School of Geography and the Environment at Oxford University. And my research considers the ways in which the introduction of novel computer simulation methodologies, such as agent-based modeling, is changing environmental governance. And I look particularly at fisheries management. Not as interesting a topic, I suppose, as spaceflight and climate and art, but perhaps interesting as well to some. I want to talk today about simulations in ecological research and practice more generally and historically. And I want to take a look back at some socio-ecological modeling projects that happened between the 1970s and 1990s. And just to make this clear from the start, I'm not a modeler myself. I'm not even good at maths. Instead, I study the work modelers do as a human geographer from a sociological perspective. And the kind of thing I'm interested in might be best placed in a tension between these two questions you see in the slides. We tend to think of models as simplified representations of certain features of the world. And then the question, of course, becomes, is that a valid representation? Is all the important stuff in there, entities, relations, causal mechanisms? And can I use it then to predict how the world might behave? And there's, of course, an extensive literature in the philosophy of science that discusses this representational relation between model and world, and obviously models represent something. However, if we were to change our focus a little bit and shift from the model as a finished object to a process, something that's in becoming, something that has to be produced in everyday practices by actual people in specific places using material tools, and if we were to see it as something that's entangled with the world it represents in multiple ways, then we might ask how the very practice of constructing models has effects on the world these models represent. And we might even ask whether some models actually bring about and act or perform the worlds prefigured in the model. And this performative dimension of simulation is what I want to talk about for the remainder of this presentation. I would like to organize this talk around 3 themes in performativity with 3 different models as examples to illustrate these themes. And I'm not going to bore you too much with theory, so let's just run very briefly through these 3 ideas and concepts. So first of all, affordances. So modeling is a material practice, right? It involves tools such as computers, software packages, repositories of data, and so forth. These materials afford specific practices, that is, they variously enable or constrain the trajectories of exploration of a problem in the process of model construction. And we could also call this affordance, and indeed Tarja Knutila does that, the model's workability. Second, circulations. Models are not static. They move across space and time, either as executable software or in the form of technical reports, policy briefings, or indeed PowerPoint presentations. And in turn, models also draw things and people together. They provide a site of coordination and realignment of various actors and agendas. And I show an example of that in a moment. And finally, assemblages. We can ask what else needs to be in place for the world that is represented in the model to actually come about. How is a model productively linked with other things, such as theories, tools, materials, people, linked in ways that reorganize their relations so as to bring about different realities. And that's about it with the theory. Let's have a look at how these 3 ideas actually work in practice. And I want to tell you for the remainder of this talk 3 stories about 3 socio-ecological models. So how does the materiality of modeling shape knowledge making? And the example here would be the Kerrang farm model developed in 1979. So this is about agriculture. I didn't put a picture of a cow on that. But on the left-hand side, you see a conceptual rendering of the Kerrang farm model taken from Peter J. Taylor's fantastic monograph, Unruly Complexity. Taylor is an ecological scientist himself who had a role in the construction of that very model, but has since come to question some of the working methods of ecological science from a more sociological perspective, I suppose. And the picture on the right-hand side is then from his 2005 book, where he basically put that simplified rendering into perspective and into context, and brought things in like institutional constraints, material tools, all the actors that were involved, the meteorological techniques, the spatialities, that the model was developed in Melbourne and not in the region where it actually was, and how that all might have had an influence on the development of that very model. A little bit of context, Kerrang is a region in southern Australia in the state of Victoria. I must have never been there, but apparently farmers there irrigate land for both crops and cattle grazing. But the land suffered from severe soil salinization. And in the 1970s, the Australian state commissioned a computer model to be built by researchers in faraway Melbourne, as you can see. This model should support decisions about the economic future of farming in the Kerrang area. And of course, several policies were on the table, namely funding regional drainage systems or reallocating water rights, and finally raising water charges. The modelers used a linear programming technique to determine the mix of farming activities that would produce the most income under different policy scenarios. And based on the model, the scientists recommended irrigating pastures rather than crops. However, the government then chose to focus on indicators instead that justified a policy they apparently had planned all along, namely to raise water charges. And now we could read this episode as evidencing a kind of interpretative flexibility of socio-ecological models, right? Where powerful groups are able to impose their preferred meaning on an artifact and just what it represents. But perhaps I would like to focus on the choice of linear programming as a modeling technique that produced a particular range of knowledge claims about viable policies. And apparently built into the choice of a linear program were two main assumptions, namely, first, that farmers aim to optimize a single objective, namely to maximize income, and second, that farmers would immediately change their behavior if it were not optimal towards that single objective. Other techniques could have been used at the time and were indeed discussed, techniques that would allow for the optimization of several objectives in addition to income maximization, or that would allow for the integration of empirical data about behavioral change. But the choice of linear programming as a technique was reinforced by the availability of and familiarity with particular software at the Institute at that time, and the trust placed by the principal investigator into the commissioning government agency to possess the power to enact any policy in a top-down manner. Hence the knowledge claims supported by the model. These were geared towards income maximization alone without taking into account conflicting objectives and the exigencies of behavioral change. And somewhat unsurprisingly, the policy recommendations ended up being contested then by local agricultural experts in Kerrang. So what about affordances? How did materiality play a role in shaping knowledge here? And I think the linear programming technique that was used enabled this sort of single objective economic analysis, yet the technique could have been modified, and there were attempts at doing that. But in the end, the modelers chose not to do so, based both on technical considerations and on the government sponsorship of the project, thus hardwiring certain political relations between government officials, scientists, and farmers into the very model. And I think we shouldn't confuse materiality here with the physicality of computing determining the outcome. Rather, I would invite thinking about materiality here as a relational and contingent effect of multiple actors with different agendas and the tools that are somewhat recalcitrant, that are not endlessly malleable, that are both conjoined in the process of constructing computer models. So the second example, we're staying with agriculture, but shift to the island of Bali. The question is, how do models as material artifacts facilitate the circulation of knowledge? And conversely, how does modeling set in motion a realignment of actors? How are different actors from different social worlds involved in knowledge production, and how do they coordinate? So in the 1970s and 80s, the American anthropologist Steve Lansing conducted fieldwork among rice farmers in Bali. That's Bali. During that time, the Green Revolution was in full swing. The Green Revolution was a set of policies and technology transfers that attempted to increase agricultural production in the developing world with new management techniques, irrigation system construction schemes, and the introduction, of course, of fertilizers and pesticides. But the results of that technological transition in Bali were rather mixed. By changing traditional cropping patterns, pest populations increased, whereas the uptake of pesticides and fertilizers caused damages to the wider ecosystem. And in this situation, Lansing happened upon something that local farmers were deeply familiar with, but that researchers had so far overlooked. An intricate system of temples dedicated to a Hindu water goddess and spread out over a whole Balinese watershed. And you can see these temples here on the right-hand picture, served not only a religious function, but traditionally coordinated through meticulously timed religious rituals the farmers' cropping schedules in a way that controlled pests without any need for pesticides, and that also allocated water equitably among a great number of so-called subaks. These are small agricultural communities. And this traditional system was now under threat by the Green Revolution. And back in the US then, Lansing got systems ecologist James Creamer to build an agent-based computer model that simulated the emergence of coordinated cropping patterns from the interactions between subaks mediated by those water temples, and contended that these patterns yielded far superior results over the Green Revolution-inspired rationalization schemes. And Lansing and Creamer then brought that model to Bali on an actual 1980s Apple Macintosh computer to a local water temple and its priests. And originally, I wanted to show you a little movie clip from the anthropological documentary The Goddess and the Computer, aptly named, about what happened next, but I'm just going to tell you about it. So they actually schlepped that black, gray box, that Apple Macintosh computer, to that temple and sit down the water temple priests in front of it. And they immediately get what's going on and start sort of playing with that computer. And what happens then is super interesting, because the development officials that never even talked to those water priests showed up because the computer was there, and everyone started sitting around the computer playing around with that simulation. It looks a little bit like that, just sort of more fancy. And people started talking to each other that had never before talked to each other. And basically, the computer model as an artifact enabled the coordination and realignment of these two different social worlds, right? Development officials and water priests, around a shared matter of concern and indeed a shared artifact. It wasn't totally without problems. A sort of debate ensued whether it would be appropriate for the temple priests to keep that computer in the temple, or whether the computer should be in the local tax office or somewhere else. So it was a bit of a contested object. Okay, but what's the point here? These government officials were technically trained elites, right? They had disregarded water temples as mere religious tradition to be superseded by progress, thus overlooking their crucial function for agricultural management. The simulation rendered this function, long known tacitly to local people, visible and explicit in a particular way, namely in a way amenable to the specific professional vision of scientists and engineers, to their epistemologies, their habitualized ways of seeing things. Symbolically charged with meanings of high-tech and progress, the computer model then served a crucial function for enlisting development officials in supporting a traditional, presumably obsolete approach to rice farming. And apart from this function of coordinating and mediating, the Bali Subak model also started to travel, and travel quite far. Lansing, of course, is a bit of an advocacy anthropologist, and he started writing letters to, I think, the Asian Development Bank, tasked with funding these Green Revolution schemes. And through his insistence and the sort of technical reports resulting from all of this, he triggered a review and eventual halting of these schemes in Bali. And then finally, he served also as a government advisor then. And finally, in 2012, the Subak system was inscribed as a cultural landscape on the UNESCO World Heritage List, and it still exists. So we might be tempted to say that the model here was indeed somewhat performative, right? That it helped realize a world prefigured in the model, if only to preserve and restore a threatened cultural landscape in transition that had existed before. And Stefan Helmreich, another anthropologist, makes an interesting critical point here, because he says we might also think about the politics of representation shaping this mobilization and circulation of knowledge claims. After all, it took Western anthropologists and Western systems ecologists and their translation of local environmental knowledge from a religious register into a scientific idiom with quite strong biologistic undertones to successfully speak on behalf of local farmers. And so Helmreich remarks in this context that indigenous knowledge claims travel differently from scientific ones. And the question then is whether this model, while indeed supporting an indigenous form of life, might not at the same time reinforce the hegemony of a certain Western techno-scientific rationality. But I would very much leave that open for discussion and invite your ideas on this. So last example, and I think we're finally inching closer to the problem of performativity. So to what extent might models help bring about a world prefigured in the model? How might they remake the world in their image? Not only restore a landscape, but bring about something very different. And what else needs to be in place for that change to happen? And I think fisheries management is a particularly instructive case here. So fisheries are a typical common pool resource. They used to belong to no one in particular, right? In principle, everyone could buy a boat, sail out, take out as many fish as they like. And for a long time, this is more or less what happened, until fish stocks then started to collapse. Somewhere around 60s, 70s, started to go down. And this phenomenon has been theorized in one of the most cited papers in ecological economics, The Tragedy of the Commons, published by Garrett Hardin in 1968 in the journal Science. Excuse me. So the main idea of the tragedy of the commons is straightforward enough. If there's a common resource that belongs to no one in particular, and every user of this resource tries to maximize their own profit from the resource, with disregard of the effect this might have on other users, then the resource will eventually be overused and deteriorate in the absence of any kind of coordinating mechanism. And there are some problems with this theory, namely that few empirically existing common resources actually work that way. That's something that the sort of late Nobel economics winner Elinor Ostrom has worked on. And basically Hardin confused common pool resources with open access resources and didn't do a lot of empirical work on that. However, the theory of the tragedy of the commons and the subsequent formal models of resource economies that it spawned have been quite influential in transforming the ways we manage resources, such as fisheries. And there are a great number of these models out there that are based on this idea of the tragedy of the commons. And let me just show you this particular simulation here. That's a screenshot. It's called Fish Banks. It's developed by Dennis Meadows at MIT. You can go online and play fisheries management if you are so inclined. And so this operationalizes the tragedy of the commons and is quite widely used in teaching ecological economics today. So we have a theory and a model that operationalizes a theory, but how did they come to perform the world in its image? And the clue, I think, is to look at other elements that link up with the model and the theory and that produce conditions amenable to the model's realization. And I'm relying here on the example of Norwegian cod fisheries, studied by Petter Holm and others. So one of the recommendations of the tragedy of the commons theory is indeed privatization. The other is nationalization. So basically the state runs everything. But for obvious historical reasons, that didn't happen. So privatization means turning the commons into slices of private property, which can be then exchanged among market actors, each trying to maximize the profits, and thus making sure that no one infringes on their property rights. So the underlying idea here is that if I own something, I will make sure that nobody infringes on it, right? And combined with an overall scientifically determined cap on the resource, this was then meant to make exploitation of the resource both profitable and sustainable. And in fisheries, the two mechanisms here are called maximum sustainable yield, that's the overall cap, and individual transferable quota. These are the slices of private property that fisher folk then start to exchange between each other. However, there's a problem with that. So the world didn't fit the model in the beginning. Fish don't present themselves easily as private property, right? They're not sort of just there, ready for exchange. They are out there in the ocean. You don't necessarily even see them until you catch them. So how do you turn fish that hasn't even been caught yet into a commodity that can be exchanged on the market in advance of even sending just one fishing boat out into the sea? And that's indeed what the model presupposes would happen. Moreover, Norwegian fisherfolk did not at all consider themselves rational market actors, exchanging fishing permits so as to maximize their profits. They were typically family businesses in coastal communities that had been fishing for decades, and their decisions as to how to organize their fishing activities were influenced by relations of kinship and local tradition that were quite different from a calculus of investment and impersonal exchange on the market. So quite different anthropology going on here. So today we do have a market that works quite like the model. How did that come about? I think several elements formed a network of technologies, scientific knowledge-making practices, and materials that indeed produced a world amenable for the model to gain purchase. Just some of those elements. Marine science quantified the number of fish through meteorological techniques that can be sustainably caught with practices of measurement and accounting. Lots of paperwork generated there. So from this overall number then, individual fishing quotas were calculated and allocated to fisherfolk, sort of actual paper certificates. An electronic market was installed where these quotas could be traded among fisherfolk. And the third picture on the right is basically what this market looks like, right? So someone's trying to sell fish there in advance of actually taking it out of the ocean. And then monitoring systems were installed that surveyed the number of caught fish, and quite a few other things. And then slowly but consistently a system emerged predicated indeed on competition, market exchange, and production for profit, the system we have today, and indeed a system prefigured in the models of natural resource management, underwritten by the theory of the tragedy of the commons. I think it's quite important to understand that the market envisioned in the tragedy of the commons model did not emerge spontaneously, right? It did not come about naturally, and also not through magic. It had to be engineered, it had to be performed as an effect of an assemblage of economic theory, simulation modeling, quantifying practices of marine biology, policy papers, enforcement mechanisms, monitoring technologies, and so on. So when all these things cohere into a productive network, the world indeed started to behave a lot more like the model. And not only did that reorganize coastal communities in quite problematic ways, because they could no longer rely on the commons for their livelihoods, and it led to the entrenchment of hierarchies among quota owners, now an owning class, and fishing workers. It also had a transformative effect on the fish themselves, which were now assets for investment, intensely monitored, quantified, and traded. And Petterholm speaks in this context of the cyborgization of the fisheries, and indeed of cyborg fish. Right. So to briefly sum this up, I talked about three socio-ecological models, three examples of the ways models are intricately enmeshed with the worlds they represent. And in some cases, we might even start to speak of a performativity of modeling, in the sense that the assumptions embodied in the model start to shape and change the world that's being modeled in the image of the model. And of course, especially in environmental politics, but also in the governance of markets, health policy, and other fields, simulation models play an ever greater role in generating expertise and supporting decision-making. And I think maybe to allow myself a little bit of a normative statement, rather than treating these models as truth machines, as Sheila Jasanoff has called it, I think it's time to interrogate the politics of simulation and simulations as political technologies, realizing specific forms of governance, and I hope to have shown a few entry points through which such a political analysis might be done empirically. Because the particular ways in which environmental entities are brought into society, the ways in which they are made intelligible and governable, matter. They matter because they do not leave them untouched, as we've seen. They can have a transformative effect both on humans and on the set of things we tend to group under the term nature, and that's why there is a need to interrogate whose knowledge is counter-modeling, how we might harness the capacity of models as material artifacts to facilitate coordination and perform different worlds in order to reach a perhaps more inclusive and democratic politics of nature. And there are, of course, a few promising examples of such attempts. but I'll end here and leave discussing those to the Q&A. Thanks for listening.